by which this course falls. What is environmental science? A little bit about what sustainability is and what the Anthropocene is. All right. So I like this little comic, and it's sort of a play on that sort of classic evolution comic where you have a fish comes out, gets legs, comes out onto land, and eventually evolves into man, right? And I like this because it really sort of illustrates nicely our transition from a species that was really living, maybe not symbiotically, but within pretty decent amount of harmony with nature. And then we sort of turned around about the time of the Industrial Revolution, so about the 1860s, and we really sort of started taking too much from nature and putting all sorts of nasty things into nature. So it really shows our full circle of we left the land, we were at one point a good species, and then we started treating nature kind of like crap. And not kind of like crap, we started treating nature like crap. So the gist of this course is to try to break this link. How can you as an individual become a better steward for the environment? How can we as society become a better steward for the environment? Because as we will learn, it doesn't matter what part of society it is, business, whether it's food, whether it's our air, whether it's anything, whether it's whether it's childcare. It doesn't really matter what it is. Everything is essentially in this limbo with the environment. And as we sort of progress in this course, you'll really learn how intricately connected we are with the environment as a whole. So one of the things I like to do to start off this class is I like to do a little brain exercise, I guess you could call it that. Now, if you were to think about everything on the planet, from the biggest thing, so trees, ants, the small things like ants and bacteria, fungus, cats, dogs, whales. What characteristics would you guys all think are shared in common with all life across the planet? Like characteristics, and I mean broad characteristics. Not like we have legs, right? That's clearly not true. But what broad characteristics do you think all life shares? You can dump it in the chat if you're interested, or you can speak. Doesn't really matter.
Energy, carbon.
Yeah, energy is a big thing, right? Everything needs energy. That's basically like half the point of life is energy, right? How do I get energy to do the things I need to do? Good. What else?
Someone said carbon in the chat, but we need everyone, all living things need air to survive.
We need some sort of air. Now, for big things like us, that's oxygen. But for some things out there, they need no oxygen. But we definitely all need air. That's a good point of some sort. What else? And carbon is a good thing because everything's made out of carbon. And all tasty things like Chipotle, it's made out of carbon. And obviously Chipotle is not the only tasty thing out there, but all the tasty things are made out of carbon. What else?
Everything needs to reproduce.
Everything needs to make babies. It doesn't really matter what it is. You need to make babies. Yeah, even if you're a virus, if you're COVID-19, your goal is just to make more COVID-19, right? That's pretty much all life, right? Just to make babies. We need water. That is definitely true. We need some form of nutrients. Also very definitely true. Everything is also composed of cells. Very much true. Everything has cells. So what do you guys think? Do you think the planet is random? Or is there sort of a higher order to the planet? Are things just randomly dispersed? Or, like for instance, is your body just randomly put together? Or is there an overall order to it?
I'd say there's probably like an overall order. I mean, everything in like everyone's body sort of depends on everything. Like your heart sort of keeps your body running and your mind controls your heart. I'm sure there's like a bunch of other connections, but I think there's definitely an order.
Yeah, no, life is ordered. And order is kind of a cool thing. You think of order like, your body talking to each other, but if you look at a leaf, right? You look at a flower, right? There's order to a flower. There's structure, right? It's not just randomly put together, right? There is order. Yeah, so good, some good answers. Everything the ones we got were energy, reproduction, we got order, um, but we also sort of everything. And again, this is broadly everything. Everything has to grow and develop from the biggest to the smallest. Everything has to grow, develop, change. We have to react and respond to our environment. We are not sort of immune from our environment, right? We have to do something, right? If it's, for instance, I'm in my office, it's kind of hot in my office. In response to being hot, I'm probably going to start sweating, right? That's a response to our environment. Or if it's, for instance, like yesterday and the day before, it was 95 degrees here in Massachusetts. What did I do? I turned the air conditioning on, right? So I had to respond to my environment. We also self-regulate, and I sort of touched upon self-regulation already, but like sweating, right? That's a great example of self-regulation. And everything has to evolve or adapt. Now, adaptation is short-term responses, right? It's hot, therefore I sweat. But evolution is sort of more long-term changes, how populations change in response to the environment. So all these things are shared in common across all life, big and small. So I like to sort of start off with that because it sort of gets you thinking about what sorts of things make life turn. Like what is common across all life? Because if you think about, say, comparing me to my dog, our needs are a bit different, right? If I compare me to a cat, again, my needs are a bit different. But life does have some commonalities across them, which I think is a kind of a fascinating thing. Now, the other thing I also like to show is this clock, and it's a really awesome clock. It's the 4.6 billion years of our solar system, or our planet, whichever one you want to call it, in a single hour. So when we have 1 second here, the Earth crust forms, and then we have 59 minutes and 59 seconds and 0.9 milliseconds. That's when the first modern man popped up. So all of our 4.6 billion years of this planet in a single hour. Now, there's a couple truly remarkable things about this clock, but what do you guys see? What's something that stands out to you guys? Something you think is weird? And I'll just say, for whatever reason, this is first. So it says like first reptiles, first amphibians. I don't know why it keeps getting cut off every time I make this slide, but that's what it says. What do you guys think?
Like once like the first thing with the nucleus came, everything kind of came rapidly. Like before that, like it's like over like 8 hours before something happened, and then once something happened, it all happened like at once, kind of.
Yeah, that's kind of a cool thing. One of the cool things that happened around here was photosynthesis evolved, and once photosynthesis evolved, so we produce oxygen, life took off. It's a great observation. Yeah. What else?
I think it's kind of cool that the first modern man came in the last millisecond.
Yeah, the last milliseconds of our clock, that's where we occupy, right? That 200,000 or so years that we collectively call the anthropocene, which we'll talk about in a second. That's in the waning seconds of our clock, which I think is kind of crazy, right? You think about how dramatically humans have shaped the planet. We've shaped the planet in basically a blinking of an eye on the cosmic clock, which I think is wild. Yeah, that's a great observation. Anything else?
The first like fossil evidence of life was only 13 minutes in, which is like super early, I feel like.
Yeah, that's the first fossilized evidence of life. They infer the origin of life to be about 1 billion years after the planet started, around this 9-minute mark, which is pretty cool. Life's been around here for a long time, and I think the final remarkable thing, and I'll just tell you guys why I think it's remarkable is that when you think about this life is basically the first 40 minutes of life. There's nothing that really looked like what there is nowadays, right? The first thing that you probably recognize is maybe seaweed, right? And that popped along They have a great, at least they used to. I don't know if they still do. They have a great exhibit with this sort of idea. That's really fascinating. And I remember when I was younger, it made quite the mark on me. This clock still makes quite the mark on me nowadays. But I remember when I was younger, it was really the bee's knees to me. So yeah, so that's it's really sort of remarkable thing. So just some straight numbers. The universe is about 13 billion years old. So it's really, 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 really old. You guys probably know that a difference between a million and a billion is quite a bit, right? Right. So billion is a long, long time. Now the Earth is about 4.6 billion years ago, as we said in the slide. There's lots of evidence that support that. Um, so we've as humans have been on the planet for a very little amount of time, but the universe has been around for a very, 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 very long time. Now, how did life come to be? That's a class all on its own, and kind of the beyond the scope of this class. But there's some pretty solid models out there about what led life to evolve here on the planet. We're not going to go into them, but chemical evolution is the best supported one. So if you want to Google that, you can learn a little bit about how chemistry led to the evolution of life. There's also a really cool theory called panspermia, which is why I have the ancient aliens guys over here, because exogenesis refers to life being seeded here from another planet, which I think is a kind of a cool thing to think about. But again, there are some other things out there, many, many, many other ones. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, definitely take a peek at some of these things. You obviously don't have to, but I figured I'd make mention of it because we're talking about life and we're talking about this remarkable clock. But the reality is we're only going to focus on the very end of this clock, this orange box, this 59 minutes, 58 seconds, and 0.8 milliseconds of this clock. That's all we're going to focus on for this class. We're going to ignore all the other stuff, but we're just going to focus on that. If you want to learn about the other stuff, you'd have to take one of my other classes I teach. But just for this class, we're going to focus on this last second of this clock. We're going to cut rid of the 4.6 billion years. We're going to cut out the 13 billion years of the universe. We're going to focus on this last part. Now, why? Why are we going to focus on this last part? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We live in this last part, right? Right, that's where we all live. We live in the waning parts of this clock. Now, humans as a species, so I'm sure you guys probably know, we're Homo sapiens, right? That's our modern human genus species. Depending on who you ask, and again, it really depends. But most people say we've been on this planet for about 200,000 years as a species. Now, our oldest ancestor seems to be a good-looking group of primates here called Homo habilis. And they came around about 2.6, that's supposed to be million, not billion years ago, 2.6 million years ago. After that, we had this handsome looking gentleman over here called Homo erectus, about 2 million years ago. So about, half a million years after our friend Homo habilis. And then a few million years later, Homo sapiens, us, popped up. Now, where did we pop up? Well, all evidence seems to support Africa. So there's this relatively famous hypothesis called the Outer Africa hypothesis that postulates with quite a bit of evidence that humans as a population arose in sub-Saharan Africa and radiated out through the planet. Now, this map is a little bit not up to date, but it is the easiest map to understand. So there's been some revised estimates from this map. I will say we got into North America sooner than we thought. Just to let you know, we think we got into North America about 30,000 years ago now, but I couldn't find a map that wasn't crazy. So I stick with this map because it's easy to understand. But you'll notice that we started here 200,000 years ago. We radiated out. Now, as we radiated out, we also encountered some really interesting species, not just Homo sapiens, not Homo erectus or Homo habilis, but Homo neanderthalis. I'm sure you guys probably heard of Neanderthals, right? That's Homo neanderthalis. We encountered them in Europe, interbred with them, and eventually our population expanded throughout the Now, the thing I always find remarkable about this, and it has nothing pertinent to the course, but I always find this wild, is that we made it into Australia before we made it into North America. And again, I find that wild. Given how remote Australia is, again, I just find that wild. I don't know about you guys, but I find it wild that we made it into Australia before we made it into North America. But again, that has nothing to do with this class. Now, collectively, the time by which humans have occupied this planet is what we call the Anthropocene. So it's got a canonical definition where I'll just read it for you. It's the Earth's most recent geological period as being human influence or anthropogenic, hence the Anthropocene, based upon overwhelming global evidence that the atmospheric, geological, hydrologic, biospheric, and other Earth systems processes are now altered by humans. So kind of a broad definition, but it really tells you that humans are in charge, right? That's kind of the takeaway, right? That's the Anthropocene. Now, if you ever met the department chair of the natural science department, he's a geologist. He would look at the Anthropocene and go, "That's not a real thing," and he would tell you that it's a Holocene, and that is true. Just to let you guys know. So the Anthropocene is like anthropologic term, but the actual geological term is the Holocene. Just to let you know. So now, why do we call it the Anthropocene? What are some of the characteristics of the Anthropocene? Well, the reality is it's just really broadly what I would call terraforming, right? Changing the planet sometimes irreversibly, right? Erecting massive concrete structures or metallic structures, right? Tearing down forests, dumping huge amounts of sediments, right? That's the Anthropocene, dramatically changing this. And one of the sort of the key things that really hallmarks is essentially the combustion of fuel, right? Burning wood, feces, carbon, right? Fuels, right? That's one of the sort of the hallmarks of the Anthropocene. Now, we like to think of the humans as being destructive only nowadays, but that's actually simply not true. Humans and the Anthropocene as a whole, we've been little wrecking balls since we came onto the global stage. Now, why is that? Well, I mean, the reality is we have more cranial capacity than most animals, so we can develop tools, we can think, we develop languages that are much more complex than other species languages. So we have the capacity to do it. Therefore, we kind of do it. And so you can see the way humans have evolved as a culture really throughout the Anthropocene. And again, it's not just all like catinated into modern times. It's really sort of spread out through the Anthropocene. Now, we can really start to see this 50 to about 11,000 years ago with the massive megafauna extinctions, including the mammoth. We can see the loss of the saber-toothed tiger, the giant sloths. I'm sure you guys have probably seen the movie Ice Age, right? That type of extinction, right? Losing all those cool and funky animals. And now, why is that? Well, part of it's climate, but also because humans like to hunt things to extinction. And we'll talk about that later on in the course as well. But just to put this in perspective, by the time humans made it into North America, now if we go back to our map, that was not till about 15,000 years ago. By the time we made it into North America and lived there for a few thousand years, we drove about 72% of all mammals to extinction. So cool things like the woolly mammoth, right, or the saber-toothed tiger. We drove them in a very short period of time to extinction, and it's a real hallmark of humanity, right? Nothing else on the planet can drive animals to extinction, but humans can. Humans can. Now, the other sort of big hallmark of humans is our farming, agriculture. Now, whether this is domestication of animals, that's another big thing. Now, I want to just make a quick note about domestication because I think domestication is an oftentimes overlooked aspect of the rise of humanity. And I'd like to show this through an example of a teacher I had when I was around your guys' age. I got my undergraduate at the UMass Boston, and there was a professor there named Garrison Wilkes. He's not there anymore. Now, Garrison Wilkes, as an awesome guy, studied corn. So our lovely thing, I'm sure you guys eat it all the time, even inadvertently you eat it, is kind of a staple, right, of our agricultural systems. And it's also kind of a staple of some fuels, but it is certainly a staple of our agricultural systems. Now, our modern day corn really doesn't look anything like the wild ancestor of corn. And you can really back it up through time. And this is what the modern ancestor of corn looked like. Now, you might say that's pretty dramatic, and you'd be absolutely right. But this is what domestication does. It takes plants that maybe don't have any economic value at the time or any nutrition, lots of nutritional value, but we select for traits. We breed the animals to bring out the traits that we like best, making things larger, more nutritious, potentially more resistant to pests, making them look better, because this certainly looks better than potentially even this, right? I know if I tried to get one of my cousins to eat corn that looked like this, they would never do it because they expect corn to look like this, right? So that's domestication. Now, you might think corn is unique, but it's actually not. I always encourage students to Google or search the internets, whatever you want to call it, about some domestication of our crops, because it is wacky and wild. So corn is my favorite example because it honors a teacher I really, really liked back in the day. But you can look up lettuce, you can look up carrots, you can look up potatoes, tomatoes, any species of crop that we've domesticated, you can look it up and you can see its wild relative and you go, wow, that is really unimpressive. But that's what domestication does. It takes wild animals, wild plants, makes them into what we know nowadays. And it's really a technology. It really is. We're selecting for traits that benefit us to make our food more nutritious, easier to grow and maintain, more resistant to pests. Now, domestication is not important. If you want to know why domestication is not, is not perfect, I should say not important. If you want to know why domestication is not perfect, you should Google the banana, learn a little bit about the history of the banana. It's a really fascinating history of the domestication of bananas. Definitely, if you have 15 minutes, fantastic view of why domestication sometimes fails. But sometimes domestication works really, really well. And just to show you what I mean by this, we can look at corn yields in the United States as we've domesticated things. So we have bushels per acre. So just a bushel of corn is was it like 3x3 box, 3x3x3 box or something like that. But you can see in the 1860s, we were getting about 25 bushels per acre. Now, wild corn, you only get about 3 or 4 bushels per acre. So we were going from 3 to 4 bushels per acre of wild corn, all the way up to 20 bushels per acre with domesticated corn. And then you notice about the turn of World War II, there was just a massive explosion of corn per acre, all the way up to 160 bushels of corn per acre, which is a lot of corn. You're talking about hundreds of pounds of corn. Now, domestication gave us the 20 bushels per acre or so. What do you guys think gave us the 160 bushels per acre? Anybody have any ideas? It's a pretty cool story. There was 2 German gentlemen, Haber and Bosch. I never remember their first names, but they were German. And around World War II, I'm sure many of you guys know Germans. They weren't the nicest group of people. And Haber and Bosch were actually inventing bombs because World War, right? You need bombs, cool, blow stuff up, right? They were making bombs, and in the process of making bombs, they actually discovered the process of making synthetic fertilizer. So the Haber-Bosch process was invented about World War II. Again, 2 Germans trying to make bombs accidentally invented synthetic fertilizer, but this technology of fertilizer, this again synthetic fertilizer, paired with domestication, has led to this explosion of bushels. So domestication is awesome, but when you pair domestication with technology such as fertilization or better watering regimes or whatever, it leads to some really awesome explosions of food production. And that's not just true for corn or anything like that. It's true for cows. That's true for chickens. It doesn't really matter. When you domesticate an animal, it really helps your society. And it's a really important technological part of the rise of humans. Because as you guys will learn, about 70% of all land in the United States is actually just dedicated to growing food. In particular, it's actually growing food just for cows, just growing cows, which is kind of a lot, right? So domestication might seem kind of like a one-off thing, but again, it really was an important part of human population growth. So now in the 1700s, there was a really important event, and I'm sure you guys probably learned all about that back when you were, I don't know, when did you learn about the Industrial Revolution? Probably like fifth grade, right? Something like that. But 1760s, you guys probably know the Industrial Revolution kicked off in England, took a great foothold here in the United States. So Massachusetts is a great state to learn about all the cool things about the Industrial Revolution because we were one of the most heavily industrialized states earlier on. But what did we transition from? Well, the Industrial Revolution led us transferring from manual labor, so human labor or animal labor, to the use of coal, oil, and gas, so technological labor. That was in the 1760s, and you can see that's about right here. And you see following that, human populations really just explode, which is really remarkable. So global populations, just put this in perspective, 1800s was about a billion. 2011, we're at 7 billion. And by 2050, we project about 9 billion. Now, we'll talk about these numbers next class. But again, what really drives this sort of growth? Well, it's our technology, right? It's the anthropocene, the hallmarks of fossil fuel combustion, right? Essentially in from 1800 to 2011, so 120 years, we increased our population by sevenfold, or I shouldn't say sevenfold, 7 times, which is startling, right? That's a lot of people to add in a very short amount of time. Now, before we go on, I wanted to just make note of one other cool part of this graph, and it's this part right here, this dip. Does anybody know what that dip is in global human population? Around the 1400s or so.
Black Plague, maybe?
Yep, Black Plague. Yeah, the Black Death. Yep, that's the bubonic plague, the plague that the bacteria Yersinia pestis that killed a third of Europe back in the 13 and 1400s. Yep, you can see the plagues mark on history, which I think is kind of a cool thing. Fun fact about the plague, it is actually making a comeback. I don't know if you guys know this, but the plague exists in the American Southwest. There's about 200 people get infected with it every year in the American Southwest, and it's actually making a comeback nowadays. So, just if you weren't sick of COVID, we might be sick of the Black Plague again in the future. But unlike a virus, a bacteria, you generally speaking, respond to antibiotics. So, which is makes the plague much more easier thing to deal with than than COVID. That is definitely for sure. So, and before we go on, I want to just make mention of this one topic called carrying capacity. Now, the carrying capacity we'll come back to next class, but just want to foreshadow it. It's the population size that an area can support indefinitely. So how much people you can support on a given amount of resources. So keep that in the back of your mind for next class. We'll talk more about the carrying capacity. Now, I want to talk about a really interesting phenomena, and it's called the tragedy of the commons. Now, this idea will actually sound relatively familiar to you guys, and it really ties directly into sort of our global sort of economic mindset, where we have short-term gains that essentially cause long-term harm to a system. That's what really we think about the tragedy of the commons, right? I'm prioritizing profit now, forget about the future, right? And I think sort of the best examples of this include like fisheries, where fishermen overfish their fishing stocks, and now we're seeing global collapses of fishing stocks, right? So that's sort of what we're going to sort of talk about now, is this idea of tragedy of the commons, where the overutilization of a resource, whether it's animals, whether it's plants, whether it's a resource like coal, oil, and gas, where we try to maximize profits, maximize the interest of the individual or a small group of individuals. And as we overuse or use a resource, it eventually becomes damaged and potentially becomes broken, sometimes irreparably. So I'm going to give you a quick story. It's one of my favorite stories. It's actually about the passenger pigeon. It's a pretty nondescript bird. You guys probably know that pigeons are pretty nondescript birds. They're not exactly the most exciting bird in the world, but to understand the tragedy of the commons, the pigeon is a great example of tragedy of the commons. So let's talk about the passenger pigeons, but I'd like to start off with this quote from this unknown man in Columbus, Ohio in 1855. And this gentleman had to say, as the watcher stared, the hum increased to a mighty throbbing. Now everyone was out of their houses and stores, looking apprehensively at the growing cloud, which was blotting out the rays of the sun. Children screamed and ran for home. Women gathered their long skirts and hurried for the shelter of stores. Horses bolted. A few people mumbled frightened words about the approach of the millennium, and several dropped on their knees and prayed. Now that sounds like something straight out of like an apocalyptic scenario, but really what this person was getting at is this picture on the right here, where you have these mega swarms, and I mean mega swarms of passenger pigeons. So if you guys have seen like the locust swarms in Africa, I don't know if you guys have ever seen like National Geographic about locusts in Africa, like blotting out the sun because their swarms of them are so big. We used to have similar swarms of passenger pigeons here in the United States, which I think is pretty wild when you think about it. Now, why do we care about the passenger pigeon? Well, I'll just tell you right now, they're extinct. Passenger pigeon no longer exists on the continent of North America or anywhere else on the planet. Now, how did that come to be? Well, I think these two pictures do a pretty good job of illustrating what was going on. Humans killed them, and we killed them not just in reasonable amounts, but in excessive amounts. And I love, the picture on the left is, I think is a pretty good picture. Some guys went out and killed some pigeons to feed their families, blah blah blah, sell the flowers, all that fun stuff, right? Not the flowers, the feathers. But then you have these two crazy guys, one of which is standing on a mountain of dead pigeons. Now, there's a equally grotesque photo. Is anybody here from the Chesapeake Bay area? So like Maryland, Delaware? That's a bummer. Anyways, that's a really awesome area of the United States, but there's a really awesome picture from the 1800s of the same exact picture, but not of pigeons, but actually of oysters. So for those of you that like oysters, there's a picture like this of a man standing on a pile of dead oysters, which is, I think, is equally as grotesque as this pigeon pile. Now, this is what we were doing. We were killing pigeons in reasonable amounts and then industrial amounts, right? Because clearly this is probably reasonable. If I'm going to go out and kill 50 pigeons between 4 gentlemen, that's pretty reasonable. But 2 gentlemen or many gentlemen killing a mountain of pigeons, probably not exactly the best thing. And I think these two pictures really highlight what was happening with the pigeon, right? They were a resource. Their meat, their feathers, their all the other parts of the pigeon, their bones were great resources. And we exploited them as a resource because why not, right? They're there for the taking. Now, why do we care about these pigeons? I've told you they're extinct, so they're gone from the planet forever. They were a great resource, but why do we care about the pigeons? Now, this will get into this idea of what we call an ecosystem service. Now, ecosystem services are things that nature provides to us at no cost. And we'll talk more about what an ecosystem service is next class. So, you don't have to worry too much about that right now. But the passenger pigeons provided a lot of ecosystem services. Now, why? What did they do? Well, a lot of scientists think because of how big their swarms were, they would actually disturb forests. Now, you might think disturbing a forest is bad, but the reality is when you go out into a forest that's old, there's lots of dead stuff out there. And that dead stuff and old stuff prevents young stuff from coming up. So the pigeons came in, created a nice little disturbance, and helped these forests reset. And again, that might not seem like an important thing, but forests need to be able to reset themselves. And pigeons seem to have provided that thing. Now, to give you an example of what that looks like in modern times, that's what fires typically are supposed to do in California in the Pacific Northwest. Right? They're supposed to come through, clear out dead stuff, allow brand new things to come up. And that's what we think the pigeons used to do. Now, we also know that pigeons seem to increase local biodiversity. Now, remember, biodiversity is the species diversity in a given area. Now, and they did this by a couple ways. They would poop everywhere. So I'm sure you guys have probably seen cars, maybe not as bad as this car in the lower right-hand corner, but covered in poop. or guano, and that provides some great nutrients for plants, and plants feed other things. So they were helping lots of other animals with their poops. They were also food for predators, and basically act as this great way to essentially enhance forests, allowing the forest to regenerate, allowing forests to get more nutrients, getting nutrients for predatory animals. And so they played a lot of roles in the North American landscape. I'm actually going to skip that. Yeah, let's skip that. Now, that's the passenger pigeon. So it's a bird that's gone extinct, but it was originally a resource that humans used to use quite heavily. And we used the resource so heavily, we drove the birds to extinction. So we maximize short-term profits at the expense of long-term profits. Now, what we would call a sustainable harvest of the passenger pigeons look like? Well, a sustainable harvest, i.e., like it's there for the next generation, what would that look like? Well, the passenger pigeon wouldn't have gone extinct, right? A sustainable take on the passenger pigeon is, well, they're still around and they're there for future generations as well. So we essentially, again, we threw this idea of tragedy of the commons at the passenger pigeon, overexploited them as a resource, leading to their overall extinction. And that is something that's uniquely human. There's no other species on the planet that does that. None. Animals or bacteria, nothing ever takes more than they actually need. And humans do. And we do it in such a directed fashion that we can drive an entire species to be extinct from the planet. And the reality is the passenger pigeon is not unique, right? I mentioned 72% of all North American fauna is gone because of humans, right? Overusing them as a resource. But we know other things like, say, for instance, the dodo bird. Again, gone from the planet because of overexploitation by humans. Now, before we move on from the passenger pigeon, I wanted to just make mention of this cool thing about the passenger pigeon. There's a pretty cool project, if I'm not mistaken, at Harvard University, but I might be mistaken. Harvard does all sorts of cool stuff. So I always kind of default to Harvard for all sorts of cool scientific things. Like, for instance, like Harvard has a project right now going where they're trying to reverse engineer dinosaurs from chickens, which sounds like a terrible idea, but it also sounds like a really cool idea, right? But there is a really cool project out there about the de-extinction of the passenger pigeon. Figured I'd just make mention of it. It was a really important bird at one point, but there are some scientists trying to bring it back to life, which I think is kind of a cool thing. So we talked about the passenger pigeon. We talked about this idea of tragedy of the commons, right? Overexploiting a resource for short-term gains at the expense of long-term gains. Again, that's a pretty good reflection of how we, as a society, view any resource. I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find a resource that we don't exploit like that, right? You can think of something that's integral to human society, like fossil fuels, like gas and oil or coal. That's a resource we've used heavily, and we're projected to run out of it in the not too near future. So there's very few resources out there that are natural that humans don't exploit for our own gain. And typically, it's short-term gain. So that's human lives and our needs matter. And sometimes that anthropocentric worldview extends only to a limited number of people. Now you might ask yourself, what does that mean? Well, I think Nestle is a great company that highlights this idea of anthropocentric worldview. We could look at what Nestle does in Africa as well as Southeast Asia. They essentially buy up water rights from the poor, and they basically sell it back to them at a premium. Right, so you have Nestle as a company that their business model is buying water. That's fine. That's what their business does. But they exploit this resource that only what their sort of needs as a company really matter, sort of relative to, say, people in, say, Malaysia, where they're doing it. So that's an anthropocentric worldview. Now we can think about a biocentric worldview, where every organism, even potentially like the passenger pigeons, they matter and they have a right to exist regardless of their benefits to humans. That's that would be like if PETA wasn't kind of crazy, that would be PETA's worldview. But PETA does all sorts of shady things. So I think PETA is a good place to think about a biocentric worldview. Really thinking about, every animal matters. And then our final sort of worldview is what we call an ecocentric worldview, where the entire ecosystem, including pigeons and humans, matter. And that's more of a scientific worldview where everything is interacting, everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. And so those are sort of worldviews. Now, this leads us to our sort of our final sort of talk about this, and then we'll talk a little bit about the scientific method, which is sustainability. Now, sustainability it's actually kind of a buzzword. You'll see a lot of companies using it on their websites nowadays, like we're sustainable. So for instance, like, I actually think the best example of this is I see my garbage is in Massachusetts is picked up by Waste Management, that's just the name of the company. And on their side of their trucks, they say sustainable green energy from trash. Now, what does that mean for them? Well, they take the gases produced via trash and they burn them to get energy for their plants. And so you you have their sustainability, right? They think that's sustainable. It's not, but they think that's sustainable. Now, and again, I bring that up because it is a buzzword. You'll see it all over the place. Companies are making a much, much larger effort nowadays to appeal to younger folk, including myself. I like to consider myself a young folk still, about being sustainable. Now, what does sustainability actually mean? If they did it sustainably, the passenger pigeon would be alive today, and the passenger pigeon will be alive in 50 years from now. That's what we mean by sustainability, keeping things around for an extended period of time. Now, it is a buzzword, but it also is an important word for governments out there. So, for instance, in 2015, the United Nations did designate Sustainable Development Goals as one of the primary mechanisms to end poverty. And also for building better economies worldwide. So sustainability is not just a word of scientists. It's not just a word of trying to keep animals alive. It really is directly tied to our economic systems as well. Because if your economic system depends on the passenger pigeons and you cause the passenger pigeons to go extinct, well, you kind of not sustainably harvested the passenger pigeon, which obviously killed the passenger pigeon, but as nature goes bye-bye, so do humans. That's sort of the way I like to tell students. If we kill nature, we're going to die shortly thereafter. So, all right. So, the sort of the final aspect of this class, and it becomes it becomes more and more important every year. And I hate the fact that it becomes more important every year. Is this idea of the scientific method, how science works, and scientific literacy. And I say I hate it becoming more and more relevant every year. And it's not because I don't want people to learn about science. It's just that it becomes more and more politicized every year. And so you can sort of see this rise in many different movements, whether it's people that say COVID vaccines are microchipping people, or that COVID is a hoax, or you can see people saying that vaccines cause autism, or you can see that the people think that birds aren't real, or the earth is flat, right? And those sort of conspiracy theories come to be because of really this lack of scientific literacy, the inability to have the tools to understand the natural world around you. Now, everything we're going to talk about in this class is grounded in scientific data, scientific knowledge, and scientific consensus. I don't want you to ever get the idea that I'm telling you something that is my opinion. Everything we talk about is grounded in some pretty solid scientific truths out there, especially things like climate change. We're going to talk about climate change and food, all things that are controversial, but they are grounded in scientific truth. So I just want to let you guys know that right up front. That's what we go through in this class. It's all based upon science. Now, will I say things are cool? Yes, because I think these things are exciting. but I don't want you to get trapped into thinking, oh, he thinks they're cool, thus they're not, he's exaggerating or something. No, it's just, I think everything is cool with science. So, but I do want to make sure you guys know how the scientific method works. So when I assign you a reading or when I assign you a podcast, that, there's some good scientific literacy, there's some good scientific thinking that goes into those things, that I'm not just assigning them because they fit my worldview or anything like that. This is how science is done. So let's talk about it. So let's give it a hypothetical example here. We have a problem, and we recognize that problem is my cell phone does not work. As I mentioned the other day, I just moved in. My sister moved in with my mom in this brand new place in Braintree, Massachusetts. So it's just south of Boston. And this is actually a problem we had. So my mom's cell phone would not work. And so that was our problem. Now we collected some data. So I asked her, and this actually really fits perfectly with this chart, which is kind of nice. I asked her, is it charged? Yes. Is it on? Yes. Does it have a signal? Well, there was no signal to her phone. You looked at her little thing. She has AT&T. There was no little bars, those bars. There's no bars. So I said, okay, with that, let's propose a hypothesis. I obviously didn't say that, but in my own way, I said, okay, let's say that the cell phone is not working because there is no service. So what did I do? Well, she lives in the basement, a basement apartment now, with my sister, and so I went upstairs to the lobby, and lo and behold, her cell phone now works. So we tested the hypothesis. So we identified a problem, we collected data, we proposed a hypothesis, and then we tested said hypothesis. Now, what is a high scientific hypothesis? Well, it's really just something within essentially a question, a framed question with an abundance of supporting data, and very little or a little bit of very little or no contradictory data. Now, as that sort of builds up in certainty, we start to get into what's called a scientific theory. Now, a scientific theory is kind of a big deal. So, like, when you think about sort of average everyday life, if I said that cats are evil as a theory, well, you would sort of take that as, he's just kind of a crazy guy, right? Saying that cats are evil. Though they kind of are evil. I had a cat for 20 years and she was pretty evil. But that's beyond the point. Now, in average everyday life, a theory is no big deal, right? But in the scientific context, a theory is a really, really big deal. It really is. I just want to sort of highlight that when we say the theory of evolution, that's a really big deal. It's not, theory carries a lot of weight in scientific terms, just to let you know. And to sort of highlight that, there's another classification of scientific ideas called a principle. Now, a principle is sort of an in-between ground between a theory and a hypothesis. So it's got a decent amount of supporting evidence, but not a ton of supporting evidence. And sort of highlight how that works. There's a principle called Bernoulli's principle. Now, Bernoulli's principle is a physics principle, so we won't get too much into it, but Bernoulli's principle actually describes how airplanes take flight. So I was on an airplane the other day, and Bernoulli's principle described how that airplane took off and landed. So how it took off here in Boston and landed in Rochester, New York. That's a principle, but a theory is another step up from a principle. So I don't want people to get sort of trapped into thinking a theory doesn't mean anything. A theory means a lot. And I mean a lot in a scientific context. Now, that's a sort of a simple example. We can sort of think about a much more complex example, but that's whatever, the same thing. But we'll do this with funny pictures. We'll do this with memes. So you guys are probably around 10 when most of these memes came out. I was in my early 20s. But the scientific method can be boiled down to my favorite TV show. So we'll start off with Fry from Futurama, where Fry makes an observation. We have a guy who asks a question, and then that leads to a hypothesis and some sort of prediction. Then we have to do some experiment with Science Cat, and then it leads us to some sort of results with Hell Yeah Baby. And that either leads us to reject the hypothesis, leading to new hypotheses, and repeating this process over and over again, or a theory, which leads us right back into the system. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wow, my professor is so cool using memes from 2010s, the early 2010s. I know. However, this is a great way to sort of illustrate how science works, and it's really cyclical, right? It never really stops. And that's the sort of the best part of this, right? This boils it down to funny memes with Jackie Chan and Fry and Keanu Reeves. but and cats, obviously, because you can't have the internet without cats. But it really does illustrate the way we do this, and it really does illustrate the sort of the cyclical fashion of science and how it never really stops. So we're going to be hearing about COVID-19 for years and years and years to come, because the science on COVID-19 is never going to stop, which I think is a pretty cool thing. Now, how do we disseminate scientific information? Now, there's two primary mechanisms by which we do that. The first is like scientific talks. We're not really going to talk about that, but if you go to a conference, you can hear a scientist talk about the research. That's one of the ways we do it. But the primary way by which science gets out is through studies and journal articles. So there's an observational studies where essentially you collect data in the real world without manipulating a subject. So like what is the average blood pressure of North America? You don't test anything. You just say, hey, what's the average blood pressure of North America? Which is in contrast to an experimental study, which is the intentional manipulation of a subject in a lab or a field. Now, a great example of this is like the COVID vaccine. How did they know it was 95% efficacy for, say, Moderna's vaccine? Well, they did an experimental study. They gave some people a placebo, they gave some people the vaccine, and they compared the two groups. That's what we mean by an experimental study. Now, once you do these studies, how do you get them out to the public? Well, you publish them in peer-reviewed journals. So these are two articles actually from a colleague of mine. You guys ever have a chance at Bentley to take a class with Dr. Elizabeth Stoner here? She's the first author on these papers. She's absolutely fantastic. I just stole these because I didn't want to put my own papers up there. I don't know. I thought that'd be bragging too much, so I stole her papers. But if you ever have a chance to take a class with Dr. Stoner, she's fantastic. But you can see these two different articles. One looking at observational and one being an experimental study. Again, this is how scientists disseminate things. Now, why do we care about scientific articles? There are some for you guys to read this semester, and you will find them all the time out in the wild. But what is so important about a scientific article? Well, the important thing about them is that they are typically peer-reviewed. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm sure it probably exists in other disciplines as well. But peer review is when you have an expert review your scientific method, review your statistics, review your data to see, is it accurate? Can you make the conclusions from that data that you claim to be making? That's what peer review means. Now, there's good peer review and bad peer review out there. That's a thing. But generally speaking, most peer review makes science more sound. That's kind of an important thing. When something is peer reviewed, you can be much more certain it's robust. You can draw better conclusions from the data. Now, who funds scientific articles? Typically, they're funded via the government. So, for instance, in the United States, we have the National Science Foundation, the NSF, or the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. I'm sure you guys probably have heard about the NIH a ton since COVID started. But typically, those governmental bodies provide scientific funding for scientists such as myself. Now, when it's government funding, it's your tax dollars. So it's kind of nice because, when you fund scientists, they produce stuff that helps you, which is, I think, is kind of a cool thing. When that's in contrast to studies that are funded by private companies, so by an investor or a company as a whole, there's a really good example of this recently. So, for instance, I'm sure you guys probably heard of Juul, the people that make those USB vapes that people love for whatever reason. They actually just paid for an entire journal issue in a physiology journal to show that to publish studies that said Juul was beneficial to society. So there is government funding and private funding, and it is important to understand when you're evaluating science where that funding comes from. Now, journals have tiers. Not all journals are good. There's some journals that are really, really good. So like Science and Nature, there's some really great journals out there that publish groundbreaking science. But there's also a lot of really crappy journals out there that publish not good stuff or stuff that's not very impactful. And then there's straight up what we call predatory journals. Now, what is a predatory journal? You can take a peek at this guide from Yale. But predatory journals basically take money from scientists, and these are scientists that either don't know any better or don't give a crap, and publish science without ever reviewing it. So it's making money off the scientific publishing process. And that probably doesn't surprise you guys at all, because if there's an opportunity to make money, someone's going to use that opportunity to make money, right? So that's kind of an unfortunate thing. Now, the bottom line for this, and why I go through sort of all this, is that we are talking about a lot of science. It's all been published in peer-reviewed journals. There's a lot of sound science behind what we're going to talk about this semester. But it is important that when you leave this course, that just because something is published in a scientific journal doesn't always mean it's perfect. So for instance, you guys might remember early on in the COVID pandemic, there was this whole thing about hydroxychloroquine paired with azithromycin curing COVID. And how did that come to be? Well, it was published in a scientific journal and it got through with really, really bad peer review. And it made people, I mean, there was obviously politics behind it, but it made people think that it was a cure, but it really wasn't, because it was bad science that got bad peer review that caused lots of public disinformation out there. And there are still people to this day who believe hydroxychloroquine cures COVID, but it just simply doesn't. So that's why I want to just sort of make note of that. Science is always interpreted in the larger context of data. Now, good science itself does protect itself from error with proper experimental design. So very, very large data sets. I'm sure you guys probably know this. If you survey 100 people versus 1 million people on a topic, the 1 million people is going to be much more accurate, right? That's just the same thing for science. Bigger data sets, more accurate conclusions. Replication is important, i.e. I try things multiple times, right? So when you look at the studies, the vaccine trials for COVID, they had 40,000 plus people. That's a big data set across multiple countries at different times. That's an important part of science. Make sure things work through space and time. Proper controls. Now, what does control mean in science? Well, what's happening in the absence of your treatment? If I'm trying to see if the COVID vaccine works, I want to know what happens when I give someone a placebo and what happens when I give someone the actual vaccine. Right? Proper controls and appropriate math. That math is an important part of science. There is a sort of important note, and a lot of I see this a lot of times in journal, like a popular journal like New York Times, things like that, CNN. They pick up on a study, they think it's cool, it sounds awesome, but there's a really problem with correlation. Now, correlation does not equal causation. So if two things are correlated with one another, doesn't mean one causes the other. So there was this really wild conspiracy theory, I'm sure you guys remember, about 5G causing coronavirus. And people were trying to make these correlations between the rise of flus with the implementation of 5G and 3G and 4G and all those Gs out there. It was just simply a correlation that was there, but there was actually no causation behind it. Now, just to sort of illustrate what that means, this is my favorite one. So this is a website called Spurious Correlations. If you guys want to take a visit to it, it's really fun. But it's just a website about things that are correlated with one another. Now, what do we have here? Well, this is my favorite one. I don't know why it's my favorite one. It just always just sounds funny to me. I think it's just because Nicolas Cage is such a polarizing actor. You either love him or you hate him, or he's really good or he's really bad. But we have swimming pool drownings in red and Nicolas Cage films in black. And you can see they track pretty well. They're pretty heavily correlated. So for those of you that know your math, the R value here was 0.6, which is pretty good. So 66% correlation about that. So again, they're correlated, but Nicolas Cage films don't cause people to drown, right? But they're correlated, right? And so that's an important thing to think about with science. I'm actually going to skip this. Now, the final thing I'd like to sort of talk about is bad science, and I think bad science is an important thing to understand. And I'm just going to give you a pretty relevant example. But not all scientists or people that fund scientists or scientists themselves are legitimate data, right? There's all sorts of money and political reasons. People like to suppress data. They have very bad experimental design and the use of statistics. They is the malicious. There's also sometimes the accidental part about bad science. And to sort of show you what this looks like, I just want to give you the easiest example to understand and probably one of the most relevant examples. And it's actually this paper published in 1998 in a journal called The Lancet. Now, The Lancet is a pretty good journal, but the journal article is, as you can see, is retracted, but it's called Ileoid Lymphoid Nodular Hypoplastia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. That's a mouthful of just saying gut problems and autism in children. Science, it's medical term, right? And so some of you might know where I'm going with this. But before we go, I want to show a picture of my dogs because they're cute. They're cute. Because we're talking about bad stuff, so I'll show you cute pictures of my dogs. But this is a great example of a journal publishing a really important study that started an entire thing. Now, what did this bad science do? Well, the reality is this bad science really kicked off this idea of the anti-vaccination movement. This science that was done on a very small sample size, that had really poor control groups, showed a link between autism, gut issues, and the MMR vaccine. Now, this really bad study kicked off this entire issue of the anti-vaccination movement. Now, you can read about these here. I've linked 2 things here. But again, this really shows you how bad science and how people interpret bad science can lead to some really serious things. And that's going to be it for today.